Welcome, good evening. My name is David Mallaghan, spoken word artist and organiser of Scene of the Rhyme. Welcome to Green, White and Gold Gaza podcast. Today is the 3rd of April 2024. Today joining me is Kev OFaolain, activist and poet. So Kev, let's talk about Gaza and the ongoing genocide. What's happening in Gaza right now?
Well, Dave, that's a big question. Where do we start? Over the last couple of days, today is the 3rd of April 2024, and just yesterday we had that terrible atrocity. Well, they're all terrible atrocities. There's none worse than the other. Of the World Centre Kitchen, where 5 or 6 aid workers were killed. Apparently, 3 of them were British nationals, and I've heard rumours that they might actually be in British intelligence. So that's going to be something that's kicking off, and the world is absolutely outraged. Netanyahu is still banning UNRWA in Gaza. UNRWA are the largest aid organisation in Gaza. They're the ones with the most developed network and infrastructure. Most of their board of directors are ex-US ambassadors. Their director on the ground is an ex-US military officer. Netanyahu and his compadres are coming out with all sorts that they're this, that and the other, but sure, there you go. What do you believe? You don't believe a Zionist, that's for sure. The US is in turmoil. People are turning on Joe Biden and his handling of the Gaza crisis, genocide. Yitzhak Herzog, the president, apologized for the World Centre Kitchen atrocity yesterday. It's interesting, Herzog's father was born and grew up in Dublin. Very, very serious Irish connection there. They say AI was involved, but I've read differently. The 3 vehicles yesterday were targeted by human hands and human eyes. They were targeted separately. The explosions were 10 seconds apart. It wasn't AI. It was deliberate, and you could see from the air the World Centre Kitchen logo. It was clearly identified. It had full clearance from the IDF for safe passage. So the whole thing was just bizarre, an absolute atrocity, and the world is outraged. And just to say that over the last 6 months, Gaza has been on about 20% of its normal import of goods into the occupied territory. And even before the last 6 months, this time last year, the Israelis were imposing a blockade which was allowing only about 90% of the calories calculated to be needed at any given time period into Gaza. That's dropped to about 20%. So Gaza is now in full famine. The most the most people in famine on earth are in Gaza right now. And I suppose at the moment, one of the possible blessings is that yesterday's atrocity might have caused Israel to pause and think about going in on the ground into Rafah. Would just be much of the same, slaughter of thousands of civilians, followed by a ground incursion, followed by battles with Hamas. Hamas, as you might know, have not been even remotely dislodged from northern Gaza. They're still taking on the IDF up there. They're still destroying tanks. There's been 6,000 medivacs by helicopter of Israeli personnel since last November. Based on average ratios from previous conflicts, you're probably talking about 2,500 IDF soldiers killed and many more severely wounded up in northern Gaza. So that's kind of in a nutshell what's going on at the moment.
That's pretty grim stuff, Kev. Israel has been obliterating Gaza, its people, its infrastructure, its homes, schools, churches, mosques, universities, pretty much everything since November. Can you give our audience some of the detail on that?
Well, since November, when they really went in, there's 40,000 dead at minimum. There's 32,000 confirmed, and there's probably another 10,000, 12,000 beneath the rubble. Obscenely, they've started bulldozing the rubble now to make way for this famous pier that the Americans are going to build for their humanitarian effort. Like a lot of rubbish, actually, to be honest. But there's bodies in that rubble that they're bulldozing and going into the pier. It's just an obscenity. There's 80,000 plus severely injured, and we're talking severely injured. An average of 10 children a day have lost one or both limbs, legs, lower limbs. since the genocide began. And since January, most of those amputations have taken place without anaesthetic. It's a truly appalling situation. As you know, Yoav Gallant, he's one of the ministers in the Netanyahu government. He immediately imposed a complete food, water and fuel blockade into Gaza. That was going back to the 10th of October. It's continued to this day. The Israelis say they're letting in food. They're not. It's 20% of the food, medicine, water, etc. that is actually needed in normal, peacetime in inverted commas there. Netanyahu's Amalek speech, remember what the Amalek's done to you, go and kill them all, every man, woman and child, from the Bible. Really, really perverse stuff. Yoav Gallant with his Palestinians are human animals. Ben Gvir in February, he's one of the most obnoxious and repulsive human beings I've ever come across. In February, he called for the IDF to shoot women and children. And they have been, but they were shooting them before that. You might remember just before Christmas, a woman was leading her elderly mother in the Church of the Holy Family, where they were seeking refuge and they were shot by snipers in the head, 2 of them dead. And that's just one example. The 4 Christian churches, there was a Roman Catholic church, Greek Orthodox, an Anglican, and I think a Lutheran. They're all smashed. St. Porphyri's Church, which is 2,000 years old. Actually, I beg your pardon. It's 1,600 years old. One of the oldest buildings in Gaza. Been a church for 1,600 years with an active congregation. They all have active congregations, despite what they say about Hamas not tolerating other religions. 4 Christian churches all blown to bits in Gaza over the last 6 months. And Smotrich, another absolutely despicable human being, and I use the word human being there advisedly. He called in December for complete expulsion of all Gazans into the Sinai, which is a desert. Egypt is saying no to that. In February, Smotrich came out and said that hostages are not important. So that all this talk of free the hostages, well, the Israeli government don't care about them. And then you have Daniel Hagari, the IDF spokesman, in October. He literally said our emphasis is on maximum damage, not accuracy. Really, really twisted stuff.
These are such repulsive statements made to the watching world. Do you think the genocidal intent as far as the Genocide Convention 1948 is defined?
Absolutely. And interestingly, Mally, the Genocide Convention was signed on your birthday. So there you go. How about that?
Wow, that's an interesting factoid.
Yeah, well, actually, here I want to correct you. Factoids are things that are taught to be facts, but actually aren't. That's my grammar neo-Nazi, or my grammar Zio-Nazi coming out.
What's going on can indeed only be described as genocide. What brought us to this harrowing place?
Well, there's multiple things. Where do you start? Like, in the rub to it, I think what really drew it was the pre-October 7th normalization of relations between Israel and other Arab states in the region, which basically pushed the Palestinian issue off the table. It was kind of like, you're forgotten about. Goodbye, good luck to you. That definitely was a factor. They're sitting there in the world's biggest concentration camp going, we're not going to be forgotten. Now, they had been planning this breakout. It effectively was a military raid. They wanted to find out who was spying among them in Gaza, because there was a lot of spying going on. And they wanted to capture as many hostages as possible and bring them back alive to Gaza, because there was at the time over 4,000 Palestinians being held in Israeli torture chambers without charge. And they wanted to do a prisoner swap on that. Jake Sullivan, ironically, the national security advisor to the US, he said a week earlier that the Middle East was the most stable it had been in 2 decades. That just goes to show what the US know. But ultimately, you had 2.3 million people living in what effectively is the world's largest ever concentration camp. Everything they did, everything they imported, every aspect of their lives is fully controlled by land, air and sea by Israel. Most of Hamas or Al-Qassam fighters, they would have grown up in that concentration camp. They would have been 2 years old on average when Operation Cast Lead killed 1,500 people in the slaughter in 2008. And they would have been, 8 years old in 2014 when 2,500 people were destroyed. Me and you were watching that actually on YouTube at the time, but we could only see it from a distance. So that's really the kind of immediate run up to it. You've got a concentration camp, you've got the Palestinians being forgotten and just left out of all sort of conversation internationally and geopolitically. And you just have persistent slaughters. You know, I mean, since 2008, you've probably had in excess of 5,000 Gazan Palestinians killed in the regular slaughters. The Israeli refer to it, again, obscenely as mowing the grass. So that was the initial run up to it.
So, October 7th, can you give us some detail on what actually happened? There's a lot of theories going about.
Yeah, well, on October 7th, basically a well-planned and a long-trained-for military raid took place. It is described by kind of military professionals as a textbook military raid. So about 7 a.m, they broke out. They broke through the fences. Now, first of all, they shot down all the cameras and all the automatic machine guns that would literally shoot you on sight without any human having to intervene. So they broke down them, they broke down the fence, they paraglided in, and their goal was to pick up as many hostages as possible, but also to get into the IDF Intel operation hub just a couple of miles outside Gaza and pick up the hard drives there and find out what's on the hard drives, who are the Israelis dealing with inside of Gaza. And basically, there seemed to be no reaction for a while, but they picked up a lot of hostages. Now, there was atrocities committed, there was people shot, but don't forget that the kibbutzim around Gaza are part of the concentration camp apparatus. They're not just nice little peaceful villages. They're there specifically to contain and be the first kind of line of defense against the Palestinian population of Gaza. So that's initially what happened on October 7th.
So what about these truly lurid stories about mass rape, beheaded babies, babies cooked in ovens, babies ripped from wombs?
Yeah, these are really, really, really obscene. They've all been totally debunked. 100% debunked. Mass rape, that was the big one. Everybody, they raped everybody. There is not one single piece of forensic evidence in the possession of the Israelis from all of these dozens, if not hundreds of people women supposedly raped, that indicates rape took place. Literally not one. There's no eyewitnesses. There is a couple of people that said, I knew someone who told me. So it's he said, she said, but literally no forensic evidence. And with mass rape on a scale like that, that's just impossible. So it's been completely debunked. There was a woman called, what was her name? Oh, not Yasmin Porat. Let me see my notes here. Sorry now there, Radio Land. I just want to find it. It's quite important actually. Oh God, I can't remember. It'll come back to me in a minute. Oh, Gal Abdush. So Gal Abdush, the New York Times ran a story about Gal Abdush. They interviewed her family in Israel. Then they ran a story called Words Without Screams, where they basically said that she was raped before being killed. And her family actually threatened Jeffrey Gettleman, the author, and the New York Times with legal action to retract the story. Her sister, Miral Alter, was speaking to Gal Abdush while she was fleeing the Nova rave. And she said, they're shooting everywhere. There's Israeli IDF shooting, there's Hamas shooting, it's chaos. And minutes later, she was dead. And she wasn't raped. There's stories like that, those lurid stories, there's no backup for them. The beheaded babies, that one just kind of quietly faded away. 40 beheaded babies and no, shall we say, bodies, forensic evidence. Babies cooked in ovens, that was absolutely appalling. That was brought out by a guy called Yossi Landau, a regional head of a group called Zaka. They're notorious. He basically said he physically saw cooked babies in ovens, and he said that he saw fetuses ripped from wombs. And we know from the IDF and the Israelis' own kind of body count, shall we say, that one baby was killed most likely by IDF fire in the crossfire. There's no evidence at all for babies in ovens, no evidence at all for beheadings, no evidence at all for fetuses ripped from wombs. It's just been an absolute tissue of fabrication, lies, and incitement material that was immediately launched with the goal of just stirring up rage in Israel and outrage across the world.
The supernova rave in the desert. A lot of casualties there. What have you learned about that and what transpired there on October 7th?
Well, this is a really, really big one. There's photos online. I literally counted the cars in one photo. There was 120 cars. They are absolutely smashed to bits and incinerated. They are like, I've never seen anything like it. It couldn't have been done by small arms fire. The guys that came in from Gaza, they were on foot or they were on paragliders. They're carrying submachine guns, AK-47s, maybe the odd rocket launcher, maybe a few grenades, etc. But every weapon had to be physically carried by somebody. The cars that were destroyed at the supernova were destroyed. It is the opinion of multiple military experts that I've seen over the last 6 months. They were destroyed by Hellfire missiles from Apache helicopters. Obviously, Hamas don't have Apache helicopters. So the thing that came out of that was there were so many bodies in those cars, hundreds of bodies, and it would have been, in each car there would have been both Hamas and hostages in the cars. It took weeks to identify which body was Hamas and which body was a hostage. They were incinerated so badly. We do know that the Hannibal Directive was kind of authorized that day. The Hannibal Directive is a directive from the Israeli army saying that if somebody's been it's normally for the IDF themselves. If an IDF soldier has been taken hostage and he can't be rescued, they're to kill everybody rather than let him become hostage. They simply don't want to have exchange poems. They don't want to be in a position where they have to exchange prisoners, and there's thousands of prisoners in the Israeli jails. Hamas were not expecting that rave. They had no information on it before. They literally landed on it by accident. You have also a woman called Yasmin Porat who basically fled to, I think it was Kibbutz Be'eri, and she was captured in Kibbutz Be'eri by a lot of Hamas guys. She said there was about 16 hostages and about 30 Hamas in a house, and they were shelled by an Israeli tank under the direction of Brigadier General Hiram Barak. Everybody was killed, all but Yasmin and one other hostage, and she's actually on Israeli national radio stating that clearly. So the Nova Festival, it just seems to me that the Israelis scrambled. They sent in Apache helicopters and they blew the crap out of everything. Anything that moved was incinerated. And then of course they just blamed it all on Hamas. So people looking at the pictures didn't put two and two together and go, how could an AK-47 destroy 120 cars, completely incinerate them? How could they incinerate bodies so much that you literally can't tell male from female, Hamas from hostage? They had to bring in anthropological scientists, because they couldn't even do dental records. So it does look, a question that was asked in Ynet News, Israeli kind of news site, it's a legitimate question. Did Israel kill more Israelis on October 7th than Hamas? That's an Israeli news site asking that question, not me.
Excuse my language, but how did this absolute fuck up come to be? What has led us to such an intractable conflict going on now for 76 years?
Again, where do you start? Look, it ultimately Zionism that began in the 1800s. What was his name? Theodor Herzl and others. They basically were looking for a homeland for the Jewish people. The Jewish people had suffered horrendously in Europe over the centuries between the Spanish and the French, the Germans, the Poles, the Ukrainians, you name it. They were absolutely oppressed. They were murdered. There was pogroms. They were, really appallingly treated. And ironically, people that were fleeing from persecution in Europe were given sanctuary under the Umayyad Pact, the Pact of Umayyad, in Arab lands, in North Africa, the Yemen, Iraq, Iran. There was already Jewish communities there anyway, living peacefully with their Arab neighbours. Well, there were actually Arab Jews as well. There's not, some Jews are actually Arabs. But really where it came from was after World War One, the League of Nations was established. It issued Covenant 22 in 1919, and that basically mandated Britain to establish what was then a Class A mandatory territory, Palestine, as a state. Class A means it's ready for a state right now. That mandate is just Cohen's, which means in law that it's a law that's set. It cannot be superseded, retracted, overwritten by any act, treaty, act of war, etc. It's there forever. It has to be put into play. Of course, the Brits didn't fulfill it. It was supposed to be done on the demographics of the territory on the 29th of September 1923. Now, those demographics were Palestinian 74%, Jewish 11%, and Christian 9.5%, and the rest were whatever, Druze probably, or Zoroastrians possibly as well. And basically, Britain sat in it, didn't do what it was charged to do. It was supposed to do it. It didn't do it. Then World War II happened. The UN took over, and the UN then acted in what's known as a ultra vires, which means outside of its authority. As it was the inheritor of the League of Nations, it had the duty to implement the League of Nations Covenant as it was stated. They didn't. The British mandate expired on the 15th of May 1948, and the Zionists declared independence at exactly midnight on that date. And thus began.
Well, it sure is way more complex than most people probably imagine. Most people, or at least many people, feel it's just an Arab hate Jews thing. But it seems to me that religion doesn't really come into it except superficially.
Yeah, I mean, obviously religion does come into it. Look, the Jewish people were persecuted. They wanted their own state, etc., etc., etc. But essentially what they did was they decided that the Palestinian people, who had actually sheltered Jews throughout the centuries, were going to pay for the crimes of European Christians. And they literally began with immediate massacres. As I was saying earlier, 750,000 were driven from their homes over the next year. 15,000 Palestinians were killed. You had 400 to 500 villages and towns burned to the ground. Just all around carnage. And this was from a people that were kind of living sort of side by side initially, because it was a very small population of Zionists in the land of Palestine. We'll call it Canaan, so we're not going to be partisan in this. So they basically went in viciously. I mean, there's immediate massacres, and there's been periodic massacres ever since. I mean, Deir Yassin was the first one in 1948. Then you had Sabra and Shatila. That was in Lebanon. I think it was 1982. Like 2,500 people, Palestinian refugees, were killed there. Cast Lead in 2008, 1,500 dead. 2014, there was 2,500 killed. Then you had the Beit Hanun massacre. The Great March of Return then, where Palestinian youths used to march to the wall in Gaza to kind of, symbolically display their desire to return to their homeland, because it is their homeland. They are like ancestrally of that land. They share a common genetic link with modern Israelis, and in fact have more of a Levantine genetic heritage than modern Israelis. Not that that really matters. They were in situ. They'd been in situ for thousands of years. And the Great March of Return, they were just getting pot shots from snipers. 200 were killed in about 18 months. Youths, 16, 17, 18, just being shot at from who knows where, no one knew. 2021, there was another massacre of 300. It's just been ridiculous. But back to the religion thing. Hamas initially identified the Jews as the problem, and that's understandable. It was the Jewish state. Netanyahu refers to it all the time. And they were accused, obviously, of anti-Semitism, but it wasn't anti-Semitism. It was, these people have come in, they've driven us to the fern, they've driven us into the desert, and we want justice and restitution. And it's the Jews who did it. So they basically left themselves open to criticism there on that charter, which was established in, I think, 1994. It was rewritten in 2017, and basically it says that Islam is a tolerant religion. It does not tolerate any bigotry or oppression of other religions. Other religions have the right to follow their own path, especially Judaism, Christianity and Judaism, which are in Islam protected. Literally, they're termed protected peoples in the Quran. And chapter 7 and 8 of the Hamas charter says, Palestine will be free and all who live there will live together in peace. Christian, Jew, Muslim, and people of no faith. So there's no this rubbish of Hamas wants to kill all Jews. That's not true at all. Hamas wants to crush the political ideology of Zionism, which has oppressed the Palestinian people for the last 76 years. And then, of course, you have the settlements, illegal settlements in occupied West Bank. I mean, those settlers are violent. They really, really are. They come in, kick people out of their houses at gunpoint. They shoot people at random. The army backs them up. They take over their homes. People are then left to go where? The Palestinians face apartheid. They can't use certain roads. And this is in the occupied territories. It's supposed to be their state. There's arbitrary detention. At the moment, it's gone up from 4,000 in arbitrary detention to over 10,000, where people are just picked up at night generally, and as young as 10 years old, and brought to God knows where for an indefinite period of time. They could be there for a year, year and a half, 2 years on no charges, and they don't know what they're being charged with. There's over 10,000 in that situation right now. You've pictures of stone throwing kids having their limbs broke by Israeli soldiers, where they literally hold them down and break their arms with rocks for throwing stones at tanks. You remember that famous photo of the young kid Faris Odeh, standing in front of a tank? He's a real icon across the world for any resistance movement. He was shot in the neck that day after that photo was taken for throwing stones at tanks.
Yeah. I
mean, it's just absolutely shocking, right?
Incredible. Such slaughter and oppression for 76 years. When I recall what happened to Ben Follett in Derry in 1969, the Ballymurphy massacre in Belfast 1971, Bloody Sunday 6 months later.
Yeah, I mean,
but this is an order of several orders of magnitude greater and far worse.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, between Bloody Sunday and Ballymurphy was August 1971, and I think about 15, maybe 20 people were killed over the weekend in West Belfast. And then 6 months later, Bloody Sunday, about 30 people shot and 13 dead. Those massacres ignited a major conflict, an absolutely major, sorrowful conflict in Northern Ireland. It went on for 30 years. Now, just to put it in context, in 1798, Ireland rose against the British Empire in the famous rebellion led by Wolfe Tone. The rebellion lasted about 5 months, 6 months. In that time, 50,000 Irish men, women and children were killed across the country. 20,000 in Wexford and tens of thousands more across the country. What's happening in Gaza over the last 6 months is actually on that scale, except think about it like this. Gaza is 5 miles wide and 25 miles long. It's literally half the size of County Louth. And what happened in Ireland in 1798 has happened in an area half the size of County Louth in the same time. And the people have nowhere to flee to. They're surrounded by walls. They've got the sea, that's it. But the Israeli Navy, like if you can walk on the beach and get shot by the Israeli Navy. We saw that in 2014. The Israelis shot 4 kids playing football on the beach. Then they tried to say they thought they were Hamas coming out of a known Hamas stronghold, until a bunch of international journalists said, dude, we were literally sitting on the boardwalk having lunch. There was 8 or 10 journalists. We watched what you did. And Israel had to kind of, oh, well, it was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. They kill kids naturally. It's just appalling. I mean, you had Ben Gvir saying, look, literally ordering the IDF in February, shoot women and kids. They were doing that anyway.
So where from here, from today, April 3rd, 2024, what do you see coming down the road?
Hard to say. The events of yesterday, what shall we say, the massacre of the World Food Kitchen, or is that what it's called? That has really changed things now. There's real outrage across the world. I don't know. Will Israel go into Rafah on the ground? They're already bombing Rafah. I don't know how many hundreds have been killed over the last couple of weeks. Don't forget, all 1.5 million people have been forced down into the southernmost part called Rafah by the Israelis as supposedly a safe haven. And almost immediately in that tent city, Israel began bombing them. And you're talking about bombs with 2,000-pound bombs. That's literally a metric ton. It weighs that. It explodes and it destroys everything within 100 meters. You're talking just while we're here, you're talking probably over 100,000 tons of bombs have been dropped on Gaza in the last 6 months. That's the equivalent of 7 Hiroshima detonations. It's been absolutely shocking. Where does it go from here? Well, the US a couple of weeks ago, for the first time ever, didn't veto the UN Security Council on a motion against Israel, calling for a ceasefire and calling for an end to this and allow humanitarian aid in, etc., etc., etc. You have the UN Special Rapporteur saying that the conditions to qualify what's going on as genocide are, in her professional opinion, fully met. You have the ICJ issuing orders to cease and desist and ensure the protection of civilians and to prevent the possibility of genocide and any actions that lead to it. But Israel are starving people out. They're in famine right now. There's thousands dead. There's 100,000 seriously injured. People are in dire straits. And if something doesn't drastically change very, very soon, that death rate will escalate exponentially over the next month. You're talking about not just a beleaguered people, you're talking about a terrified, starving, weakened, exhausted civilian population that have nowhere to go, that have no food, no water, no fuel, no shelter, and face the constant threat of death by bombs from Israel. Where does it go from here? Well, Spain is talking about recognising the state of Palestine, which will change things materially. The legal ramifications for Israel are very, very serious, which is why they've changed their kind of tone and their wording over the last few months. They are worried about the ICJ because the implications of ICJ rulings on genocide is not just on Israel, but it's on all countries that have signed up to the ICJ, which is basically the United Nations. And countries such as Ireland, Britain, France, Germany, Australia, Brazil, Argentina, you name them, they will then be obliged to take measures, sanctions, blocking arms shipments, cancelling diplomatic missions, cancelling trade links, cultural links, etc. Israel is isolated now at the moment. Will it give it pause for thought? Well, Israel is attacking Lebanon as we speak. They're trying to drag Lebanon into the war. They attacked the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria, yesterday or the day before. They're trying to bring Iran into the war. What they want to do is ultimately bring the US into the war. And the US does not want to do that because a major regional conflict in the Middle East is a lose-lose situation for everybody. So where does it go from here? I don't know. I think the governments, especially the EU, which has been an absolute disgrace over the last 6 months, the EU governments need to stand up and do what's right for humanity and have some honour and some decency and say, this is wrong and this has to stop. Whether that happens, I don't know. If it doesn't, the outlook is very, very grave.
Well, thanks for your insights, Kev. Very much appreciated. I hope those out there in the zone have picked up some nuggets and maybe a fuller picture of what is actually happening in Gaza. And just to say, we all talk about what's happening in Gaza, and sometimes we forget it's actually happening to real human beings, the people of Gaza. These people are in a living hell on earth, living it every moment. I'm exhausted listening to you. Can we all just remind ourselves that 2.3 million human beings are living this for every second for the last 6 months, and some indeed for the last 76 years. Free Palestine.
Free Palestine.